Hi, I'm Sister Nancy Elselman, the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm the director of the Pauline Center for Media Studies in Los Angeles, California. And I'm here to share with all of you, as we reflect together, the passion, death, and resurrection, how we can grow in union with Christ. And that's about living in everyday mysticism. And to reflect what that means in our lives, and especially at this time, the holiest season of the year, what that means for us. So we're entering this Holy Week. We are here, as we celebrate the sacred Triduum. And what a Holy Week it is, right? We're all sequestered ourselves with our families, and we're trying to connect virtually with friends and our church. And in the midst of this, we can be wondering, what is God trying to tell us through all of this? What is his message to us during this time? And we can take this time about, being sheltered in our homes and as really an opportunity to go deeper in our faith, deeper in our relationship with Christ. And perhaps before now, it was a rather moderate relationship. I loved in great Lucy Maud Montgomery stories, the Anne of Green Gables, and she would say, God doesn't want you for a fair-weathered friend. That was Marilla telling Anne, God doesn't want you for a fair-weathered friend, only when things go great. God wants us to contemplate also our relationship with him. Is it to go deeper in a more profound way, to the point where sometimes now, in the midst of this anxiety-driven situation, we may feel more like Mary Magdalene, at the resurrection, at the empty tomb, when she grabs to the feet of Jesus and holds on to him. We may be feeling like that right now. And even though we're not quite at the empty tomb yet, we're leaning there, but right now we're at the horrifying scene of the cross, and we're experiencing that very much in our culture right now, the horrifying scene of the cross. And it's a time that's perhaps testing our faith. As Pope Francis said in his Urbi et Orbi address, he said, we're all together in the boat at sea with Jesus and the disciples, all of us, we're all there. And it's being tossed about by the storm. And Jesus says back to us, and back to the disciples, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? It gets us to reflect and think a moment. Why are we afraid? Have we no faith? And as Pope Francis in his address was saying, well, maybe it gets us to think about, what have we been relying on? Where are our priorities in life? And perhaps this time is getting us to reorder those priorities, to look and challenge ourselves and see what needs to be put right. This time also has us look at our relationship with God. And perhaps now to be prepared to receive that divine awakening of the soul during this sacred Triduum. And it can potentially be a transformative experience for us. It could be the impetus for us to not sit back and, binge watch on Netflix only, but rather to live out our call to be everyday mystics, to set our priorities in the right direction. So now we're at home, sequestered, perhaps doing the laundry, cooking 3 meals a day, preparing for Easter in our homes, working virtually perhaps, or helping our kids with online schooling, feeling afraid and concerned about our financial futures. Here is Jesus telling us, why are you afraid? And we wonder, why are we fearful? The monk Thomas Merton once wrote, he said, "The spiritual anguish of man has no cure but mysticism." Yes, you and I, all of us, are called to be mystics, to be imbued with the transforming presence of God in our everyday experiences. This means not only do we experience God and the spiritual, but that when we do experience it, when we do have those spiritual moments in our lives, a connection with God, that it transforms us, means that we are changed. We are not the same as a result. We encounter God and we are transformed. And that is the mystical moments of our lives. You know, you may be thinking, who, me, a mystic? I'm not, I may think of the great mystics of the church, Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or St. John Paul II or Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Padre Pio. All of these, Dorothy Day, great mystics of the church. How can I even compare or be like one of them? And yet, God is calling us, each one of us, to be saints, to be great saints. We don't have to have those same extraordinary gifts. I mean, they had some extraordinary gifts. Padre Pio had bilocation. Yes. No, we don't have those extraordinary gifts. But instead, we need to be saints who do the ordinary in an extraordinary way. I think that's something Mother Teresa said. To do the ordinary in an extraordinary way. And that's to do it with love. To do it with self-giving and surrendering love to God. But you may wonder, well, how do we do that in the midst of such fear and anxiety, which seems to be foremost in our lives right now? Well, Thomas Merton would have us look at Adam. Jesus is the new Adam. He has taken away sin. And he, on the cross, took all sin to himself and redeemed all of humanity. Well, what did Adam do? Adam put us all in this trouble to begin with. By his sin. By that original sin. And that original sin that enslaves us. And it's really that sin of Adam where he turned human nature inside out, as Merton would say. And so he made our condition, or this state of being, if sin, a reality for all of us. So we now have the task to right the wrong, to become holy, to go out of our selfish egos and to desire God, to go towards God. Whereas Adam went away from God toward his own selfish ego. He went inward and focused on himself. But God is now calling us in Christ to go out of ourselves to God. The sin of Adam really gave three things to humanity. The three things that we receive because of sin is one, anxiety. An extraordinary anxiety that can sometimes cripple us. The second thing is this frantic search for interior peace. We are always looking for it. We're always desiring it. We don't seem to ever figure out how to get to it. With all the wars of humanity and the struggles and the hatred, the racism, all of it, we're struggling against, and yet we all want peace. The third thing that all of humanity received from Adam is this desire to control. We want to be in charge. We want to be God. Not such an easy task, though. So the first thing, anxiety. We all have this voice of anxiety in us. And that's often from our own ego. Because when we're afraid, we turn in on ourselves, don't we? When we're afraid, we don't go to others to help us, through our anxiety, we turn in on ourselves and we worry and we become afraid and concerned, but overly concerned. And we're just become turned inward. And that fear that we have is really about a lack of trust. Not that we can't feel fear, but when we live in a state of fear, when we're constantly fearing and worrying about everything, it shows a lack of trust. We're not trusting that God is in charge. And then we kind of live by our own passions. We're acting out of our own insecurities. We lose inner peace the more we try to control our lives, right? Anybody who's tried to, I kind of do that. I try to control my life and all the chaos that's going around. And the more I try to organize, the more I try to control, the less I feel I have any hold on life. I feel like it's more out of control than in control. That's because we're trying to do it all ourselves. We're trying to control our lives, but also the lives of those around us. We are all, in fact, out of control because our freedom is stifled. Because sin has enslaved us. We think we're free, but the word freedom is not really in the sense of the world understanding freedom, that idea of wanting to do whatever you want, how you want, when you want, and no, there are no hindrances, there are no nothings to hold you back. You can do whatever you want, how you want it, and when you want. That's not freedom, really. That's living out of our passions. That's living out of our insecurities. True freedom is about giving of ourselves in love. True freedom is about surrendering in trust to Jesus. Surrendering in trust as Jesus did in his passion and death to the Father. When he surrendered to the Father, showing his complete lack of control. It wasn't him. He gave everything to the Father and surrendered it all on the cross. We even look to somebody like Mary, who's the example. Also, there at the foot of the cross, she's not someone who could stop the crucifixion. She also had to surrender. She also had to give of herself to the Heavenly Father in complete self-surrendering love. She was sorrowful, yes. She was feeling the pain of Jesus' crucifixion, absolutely. But she had a deep interior peace that was surrendered to God, to what God wanted of her at that moment. And that surrendering to God's will is what gives us interior peace. Interior peace doesn't take away the pain, doesn't take away the suffering, but it puts us in alignment with God's will. And so it doesn't disrupt our whole interior life. It doesn't cause us to be frantic, to be obsessively anxious, because we are in union with God's will. And this is the example of Mary here at the crucifixion. She was surrendering to God. Everything, knowing that this was God's will, but still offering her pain to the Father. Even though it was painful, she was at peace. At a time when our lives now can seem a bit out of control, we can look to Jesus on the cross and Mary at the foot of the cross as our examples of trust, of utter trust and interior peace. Humanity, we're always seeking peace. We're always seeking that peace. But we have to start with peace within ourselves. We can't just say peace in our world, stop the end of war. The only way it ends is if we ourselves are interiorly at peace. A 16th century mystic once wrote that the evil one really tries to disrupt our peace because he knows that God abides in peace. And it's within peace where God does works marvels in our lives. When we are most at peace, God does extraordinary things. So when we look, what is the antidote for anxiety, the lack of peace, and the desire to control? The antidote to all those three things that we get from Adam, from the first sin, that's still the sin that resides in us, the antidote to all of these is mysticism or contemplation. Because this contemplation, the type of being before the presence of God in self-surrendering love, open to the will of God at work in our lives, surrendering in trust, this type of contemplation, this type of a mysticism is what leads us outward toward God. Leads us to not focusing on ourselves, not focusing on our own ego, but on God. This immersion in God, that is mysticism, is looking to Christ's self-sacrificial love for us. By being transformed by our very relationship with God. And this self-sacrifice, this sacrificial love of Christ that we see, and what we desire to transform into, to live that same relationship with God of self-sacrificing love, leads us to a greater awareness. And it's not a pop psychology type of awareness, it's an awareness where we realize we are not in control. We cannot make our lives perfect, right? As much as we try to work out our paths and plan out our futures and plan out our lives, things don't always go the way we want. They don't go the way we plan. And that's because we're not in control. So an awareness is recognizing that we're not in control of this, and so we can't make our lives perfect. But we can live the moment in perfect interior peace. We cannot save ourselves. Jesus did that on the cross. We cannot do it for ourselves. And, we cannot be fulfilled just living out of our passions, living out of our insecurities, living out of, doing what we want, when we want, and how we want, as the world says, to live, a sense of freedom. That's not freedom, it's enslavement. And awareness makes us see that it's not about living out of our passions, our impulses, but it's about our temperance of those passions and impulses, not just for the sake of morality, but for the sake of love, for the sake of giving ourselves to God, who has given us everything. All we have to do is look at the crucifix. So look at Jesus there on the cross to realize the immense love God pours out upon us and all of humanity. I really like Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, and he says that if we return to God, if we are to really return to God because of that sin of Adam, remember those three things that led us, that are consequences of our sin, the sin of Adam, if we're really to return to God and subsequently find ourselves in God, then we have to reverse that journey of Adam. Adam, who went from God through himself to creation. For us to do that, we need to go for the very center of our soul to reverse that journey. So we must withdraw from creation, from the material world. Go through the center of our souls to find God. This is mysticism. This is contemplation. To go to the very center of our souls. And it's that right there where we recover the possession of our true selves. Not by a narcissism where we're looking at ourselves and can't get out of that self-centered look. No, it's a going into our depths of our souls to find God, to find our true selves, and to gain possession of our souls, and to go out of ourselves. So go into ourselves so as to then go out of ourselves to God and to others. Because we don't have this profound relationship with God just to remain in this relationship with God for ourselves. It's to go out of ourselves to others. We're called to be apostles. And to be mystics is not to hold it all, that relationship with God, just to ourselves. It's to go forth and proclaim the gospel, to go forth and bring Christ to the world. This is the divine awakening in our souls. And this type of awakening changes us. It's a true and profound conversion where we cannot remain the same person. We're changed to be the very best of ourselves, to be the most authentic human being we can be. Because when we are most authentically human is when we are most Christ-like. Jesus, who is the perfect human being, shows us what humanity, what it means to be human. He shows us what it means, that, and he did that by giving of his very life for us. He gave of his very self. If it's perfect, self-giving love on the cross. I like to read a lot of different spiritual writers and mystics, and the British intellectual G.K. Chesterton had this to say about mysticism. He said, mysticism is a transcendental form of common sense. He's kind of right. It's about common sense, but a transcendental form of common sense. And he said, let your religion be less of a theory and more of a love affair. It's about falling in love with the Lord. But until we can go to the core of ourselves to find God, we still remain in our anxiety and fear, which is a result of sin. You know, often, I don't know about you, but often I want to bargain with God, right? Especially when life seems overwhelming, and I feel overwhelmed sometimes. We may say, well, if you do this for me, God, if you take care of this whole situation that's a big mess, I will promise I will, change my life, or I will be holier, I will pray more authentically, or I will, say a rosary every single day. We want to bargain with God, right? We're telling him what to do. We're asking him in our prayer, and yet at the same time as we're praying to do his will, we're telling him how to answer our prayer. Well, that's not really prayer. That's just telling God what our will is. It's not opening us to his will. So God's not really interested in bargaining with us. He wants our love. He wants our love. If we bargain with God, he may surprise us, right? Okay, I have a little story for you. So, a man was praying, and he started thinking and bargaining with God about his life. And this man, he says to God in his prayer, God, what is 1,000,000 years like to you? And then he hears God's voice, and God says, like a second. And then the man thinks, and he says, well, God, what is $1,000,000 like to you? And he hears God's voice, and God says, like 1 penny? So the man thinks, and he's like, well, God, can I have a penny? And then he hears God saying, just a second. God doesn't want us to bargain. And if we do, we may kind of regret that. God just wants our love. And a mystic is someone who is so in love with God that they fall in love with the world. Not the world in the sense the worldly material things, but the world as far as all of human beings and all of God's beauty in creation. The mystics are strange people. Yes, they're kind of weird, right? I don't know if you heard the story of Thomas Merton. When he was in Louisville, Kentucky, from Trappist Monastery, Gethsemane Abbey, he went to a doctor's appointment in Louisville, and he stood on the street corner, and he became all of a sudden so transfixed by all the hustle and bustle and people and going by, that all of a sudden he had this profound mystical encounter where he began to see Christ literally in every human being that walked by. He had this most profound experience that he literally saw Christ in them. And he was transfixed. And at that moment, he says, he fell in love with the world. A true mystical encounter on a street corner, not in the monastery abbey, not in the chapel of the abbey, but on a busy street corner. He had a profound and mystical experience because it changed him. It changed him in how he saw the world and his need to be Christ for others, and his need to make God known in the world. So the great mystics like Thomas Merton can seem kind of weird to us. I mean, standing on a street corner and, having this strange encounter, and people probably were walking by looking at this guy and it's like, he's like transfixed. And they're probably like, okay, he's weird, and walked by. The mystics are kind of weird. Evelyn Underhill, she was also a mystic, used to say that the next closest thing to a mystic is an artist. Because artists often see to the depths of reality. They go deeper than the rest of us. We stay on the superficial often. We stay on what we see. But mystics and artists go down to the deeper meanings of reality. Also theologians. But an artist, sometimes to an average Joe, sometimes seem pretty weird too, right? But mystics and artists looks to the reality of things. But why do they look so weird to us sometimes? Well, it's because they show us different ways to follow Christ. We think of all the different mystics. Teresa of Avila, she actually levitated off the ground 10 inches. One of her sisters saw her in a time of prayer, levitating. Yeah, that's kind of weird, right? Padre Pio, as I said, he had bilocation. He was in two places at the same time. Yeah, that's kind of strange, mystics are a little odd people. But they're artists. They're artists of God. They're artists of humanity. They're artists of life. And mystics show us that. They show us different ways to follow Christ. And they invite us to consider what it means to give our lives 100% to Christ. They were not just giving a part of their life to Christ. They give everything. And that's why they're so profound and holy mystics that we can emulate. Yet they're real human beings. They struggled with all the things we struggle with. So each of us can be mystics. The mystics are not the daydreamers that they're sometimes depicted to be, and they're not. Thomas Merton probably seemed like a daydreamer right on the street corner in Louisville. But instead, mystics are most awake. They're the most aware human beings. Remember I said awareness is when we come into a profound understanding of God, a profound realization that relationship with God. So as we reflect on these days, during these days of the great mystery of our redemption, let's go into it fully awake, fully aware. Even though we can't be physically present in the church, we can follow from our own domestic church. and absorb the rich tradition of the beautiful liturgy put before us, that the church has put before us, we can still enter into this experience of the sacred Triduum as a mystic. Allow ourselves to be transformed by Jesus' peace in the face of death, by his love in the face of darkness. We desire that interior peace, but it's not a frantic searching, it's not an anxiety, and it's not a desire to control. It's about surrendering our lives to God, like Jesus on the cross. In the midst of pain, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of the uncertainties of life, when we surrender and live that surrender of our lives to God, we are the most awake human beings. We are the most aware human beings. You know, the liturgy that's put before us, even though we can't be there, we can read the wonderful readings that the church lays out for us from the scriptures. Pray and reflect on the Word of God during this time. And secondly, examine our lives, asking ourselves how we can be mystics in our everyday experiences, how we can be more aware of God at work in our lives and in the world today. These two things, pray the Word and examine our lives, how we can be a mystic today. You know, Jesus is the answer who frees us from all our anxieties. Remember, Jesus has taken away sin. He's taken all the sin on the cross. And he removes from us that anxiety. And he offers us true interior peace. And he helps us overcome our desire to control. This is what it means to be a mystic today. To live this relationship with Christ so intimately that we are transformed. We are no longer the same. We are no longer that son or daughter of Adam, but we have overcome sin because of Christ's sacrifice for us. So let us be Christ in the world today. Let us be Christ for others. Let us be love in a world that's so desperate for love and hope, and be light in the darkness of people's lives. As Pope Francis reflects on Jesus' words when he says, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" And then he addresses these words to us. And he asks us these questions. What have we been relying on in life? Where are our priorities? And we can each ask ourselves this. So let us turn now to the Lord to be transformed so as to see the world through the eyes of Christ. Let us take this time of sequestering now to make us better people, to make us holier, more loving and more trusting, and more surrendered to God's will in our everyday lives. So I challenge you to be a mystic in the world today, the mystics that the world is desperate for. And this is truly how we can be resurrection people. God bless you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.